Good morning and welcome to Westside Economic Alliance Breakfast Forum. This morning we are going to be talking with Josh Lehner, and the title is Taking an Inside Look at the Latest Economic Forecast. I want to take just a minute and thank Josh for his willingness to participate with Westside Economic Alliance, and I told him this morning that I think he is he's had more attendees at his forums than anybody in the history of Westside Economic Alliance. This year we've had him 3 times, and today, as well as other days, we're just short of 200 people in attendance. So thank you. We hope to continue to work with Josh as we work through this pandemic and through the economic forecast that becomes so important to us. So thank you to all of you that are in attendance. I would like to take a moment and recognize the board members. I think Teresa is going to be sharing that screen. We have board members with us this morning from Westside Economic Alliance. I want to thank you for the work that you do for us. I also want to wish a day late birthday greetings to Betty Atterbury. Betty's birthday was yesterday, so happy birthday to the founding executive director of Westside Economic Alliance. I'd also like to recognize all of the electeds that are with us this morning. As you can see, we have quite a few, and we appreciate all that you do for us in our community. So thank you much for your attendance here, and thank you for working with Westside Economic Alliance on an ongoing basis. As you know, Legacy Health is our breakfast series sponsor, and Legacy wanted me to share with you a few notes. Again, it's time to take your flu shot this year. Getting a flu shot now is the best way to keep you and your family safe and healthy this season. Because the flu and COVID-19 are caused by different viruses, it is possible to have the flu and COVID-19 at the same time. Lower your risk of respiratory illness this winter by getting vaccinated for influenza. It's just not too late. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention recommends anyone over the age of 6 months to get a flu shot every year. So please talk with your doctor if you have specific concerns or questions. The other thing I'd like to add to that is please make sure that you're practicing all of the safe measures to protect yourself from COVID-19. We are faced with just an unprecedented pandemic here, so we want to make sure all of you are staying safe. At this time, I'd also like to recognize our sponsor, Kaiser. Kaiser has been a sponsor with us for a number of years, and I want to thank the ongoing support that we have from Kaiser, and especially with a shout out to Brantley Detmer, our president, and to Annie Herbert, who is always engaged in all of the things that we do here at Westside Economic Alliance. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Josh, and you all should have received a program, so you have some information about his background. But at the same time, once again, I want to shout out to Josh for the work that you do, keeping us all informed, keeping us prepared for what could and may happen into the future. We appreciate the time and effort you spend getting us ready. So thank you, Josh, and over to you.
Thanks, Pam. Thanks, Teresa and Casey. It's a pleasure to be back with you all this morning. Again, another round where we're not in person and we're just staring at the Brady Bunch screen. But hopefully this will be of interest and an update on what's going on in the economy. Just yesterday, we released our latest economic and revenue forecast to the state, to the legislature. This is the first one, if you're into the public sector budgets, this is the first one that really sets the tone or the revenue numbers for the next budget cycle, the 2021-2023 biennium, which starts next summer. The numbers that we just released go into the governor's recommended budget, which will be out here in a couple of weeks. And then, of course, the legislative session will start in late winter. And the legislature will go from there. We'll have another forecast in February and another in May, and then that will determine the ultimate estimates for the revenue for the next budget period. But for now, everything continues to be tracking as expected, right? We're still in deep hole. We're still in a really bad recession. It's going to take a couple of years, even after we get a vaccine, to get out of this thing, we're thinking, but still continuing to progress, at least in the last couple of months as we were expecting it to. It's a little bit uncomfortable right now because we're relying on some big assumptions, larger assumptions, larger explicit assumptions about policy and things that are beyond the economy itself than we typically do. The first one being a medical treatment or vaccine. We're at this crossroads I'll get into in a minute, right? Where the COVID surge has never been worse. The COVID surge is unlike anything we've ever seen in Oregon. What we're going through right now is completely different than what we saw in the summer or back at the start of the pandemic. But that's the bad news. And the good news is that the vaccine trial news we're getting from Pfizer and Moderna and whatnot is even better than expected. And they can maybe start vaccinating frontline workers and the elderly population in a matter of weeks, if not months. And then the rest of us will get it eventually. So that's a big assumption because once we get the vaccine, once we get some sort of medical treatment, that's when we can really start to return to stronger growth. So we have, weakness built in until that kicks in 9 months from now. And then after that, we'll get a stronger, faster, more complete recovery. With the end of the pandemic in sight, we really need to do our best to try and minimize permanent damage between now and when the end of the pandemic comes, right? That's, minimizing the number of businesses that close, minimizing the number of permanent layoffs, the number of long-term unemployed, providing as much assistance as we can to the businesses and to the laid off workers, such that they don't close entirely, such that they don't drop out of the labor force entirely, which would be a reduction in the productive capacity of the economy, right? If people give up looking for jobs, if businesses permanently shutter their doors, the amount of goods and services that we make and sell and enjoy and buy and all that sort of stuff is smaller. And therefore the economy will be permanently smaller, at least until we get new startup activity to fill in all those empty restaurants and all those vacant storefronts and all those empty office buildings and the like. And so that's the big thing we continue to be very worried about is business closures and long-term unemployment. Another big assumption, or medium-sized assumption, it's not as important as the vaccine, but it's of a medium importance, I think, from a macroeconomic perspective, is another round of federal aid. Again, the federal aid will go a long way to helping those businesses and laid off workers tide over until the other side of the pandemic. But economists are more split on whether it's absolutely necessary for the economy to grow. It'll help. There's no one says it won't help, and we shouldn't be concerned about the laid off workers. The question is whether we need it for the economy to continue to grow. And I'll do a little bit of good cop, bad cop on why we think that's the case or not here in a minute. And lastly, the assumption regarding the recently announced and just implemented yesterday, a 2-week freeze for the state of Oregon, 4 weeks in Multnomah County to start, and we'll see where that goes depending upon whether that's sufficient enough to actually bend the curve and not breach capacity at the hospital system, right? That's the goal here, is so that we have enough ICU beds to accommodate all of us that are sick, and we're getting awfully close to doing so, or awfully close to not having enough beds throughout the state, and so that's a big public health concern. And that was announced just a few days ago at the last minute, a couple days before our forecast was released. We were not able to fully incorporate that into the numbers. We kind of locked them in a couple weeks ago, and we're doing everything else after that to get our forecast document and release and slides and all that sort of stuff done. If it stays at 2 weeks, even 2 weeks to statewide, 4 weeks at Multnomah, the expectations are it's relatively temporary, right? That's a shutdown. It's going to hurt workers. There's going to be, up to, I don't know, there's about 50,000 jobs that are probably at risk. The growth we've seen in the leisure and hospitality industry since the bottom of the pandemic, since the worst of it back in March and April, probably about 50,000 jobs that are potentially at risk. Those workers will get furloughed again. Hopefully our friends at the unemployment department, they said they've been staffed up and they're ready to process claims this time. Knock on wood that happens and we get the money out the door in a timely manner. But if they come back to work in a matter of a couple weeks as customers return, it's a relatively small impact from a macroeconomic perspective, relatively marginal impact from a state revenue perspective, a little bit less in withholdings because people aren't earning paychecks, a little bit less in business income because they're obviously the sales are down for these slices of the economy. And if we're spending less money, then we'll have less corporate activity tax, because we're not, it's kind of functioning as a sales tax type revenue stream for the state. Where we'll see the largest impact, to be honest, at least our thinking today and our initial modeling we've done in the last 48, 72 hours, is on lottery, right? When we did takeout only earlier this year for our bars and our restaurants, the Oregon lottery turned off the video lottery terminals. The machines weren't even open. They weren't even on. You couldn't even play if you wanted to, just to make sure that people weren't hanging around and playing if they could. And that's happening again. That's going to result in somewhere in the $25 to $30 million range reduction in state revenues, about $40 million in sales, $26.5 million in available resources for the state budget as a result. And that's where the largest impact will be to date. And so those bars and restaurants that also rely on the lottery stream as a supplemental form of income in addition to the food and beverage will also see another round of hit with that. But again, provided it is 2 weeks, it's something we can weather and come through, and it won't derail our overall trajectory of our recovery. But of course, if the public health situation continues to worsen and stays really bad, and some of the modeling, I'm seeing at the national level saying this recent surge we're seeing in cases isn't going to peak until mid-January maybe, so we're still 6 weeks out from the peak of the surge. That has different implications. I don't know where the public policy associated guidelines will go with that, if that's truly the case. I'm not privy to the conversations that the governor and the health officials are having and what their thinking would be. But that's a really long time to weather this storm. And so even before the 2-week freeze was announced, even before this full surge has been built into the data, we're really concerned about the months ahead, right? I think we talked about this a couple months ago, right? As we entered into the colder, wetter months ahead, we're already there. We were really worried about a potential surge in COVID cases. We're really worried about consumers pulling back out of fear over the virus spreading, and also because we can't eat outside, we can't drink outside, right? We're forced indoors more, and so the tighter space, the capacity constraints in our bars and our restaurants in terms of occupancy and the like is probably going to bind a whole lot more. Whereas in the summer months, we could at least get outside, you could space some tables out, and we could make it work. Not well, but we could at least make it work, and so that it wasn't as big of a disaster as it potentially could be because of the pandemic. And so we were very, very concerned about that. We were expecting weakness over the winter months. The recent surge in COVID cases, plus of course the 2-week freeze, all but ensures that we will see much slower growth in the next few months. And of course, it's not just about the public policies, it's about how consumers respond to the surge in viruses and how much they stay home, how much they pull back on their own out of fear of it. That also has a big implication for the economic outlook in the next couple of months. The medium-sized assumption regards, the federal package. Here you can see personal income forecast in the chart. The dotted line is what we were thinking back in March. Our pre-COVID forecast, it's really a February forecast, so before the pandemic was really on our shores. And the blue line is our current forecast for income. You'll see the first big spike in the blue line was the CARES Act when the federal government sent out the recovery rebates, the $1,200 per person, $500 per kid. And then of course the expanded unemployment insurance benefits, first the $600 a week additional benefits, then the $300 a week additional benefits, and now basically just some extended benefits without an extra top up or plus on top of the standard benefit. And so that's gone away. Our income's going, relatively stable today. Like we've had a big spike and it's come back down, but all told, between the start of the pandemic and today, our income is about flat. It's up a little bit, but it's relatively unchanged as opposed to plunging significantly like it normally does during a recession. And so we have another federal package built in. The spike looks relatively the same size as the CARES Act, but that's also a little bit misleading because the severity of the non-federal government income, the non-federal transfer payments, we're in a much better spot today because we've gained back half of the jobs we've lost, right? And so if you're to kind of strip out these federal package assumptions, right, we're at a better place today fundamentally from an economic perspective than we were back in March, April, May. And so even though the spike looks about the same size, the actual impact of the federal package assumption itself is maybe about half 50 to 60% of what it was back then. We're expecting some more aid for small businesses and for unemployed workers to continue in next year. And now, whether we think we'll get this or not, it's a little bit harder to say. A lot of macroeconomic forecasters were saying, yes, we're definitely going to get a package. There was progress over the summer. At least there were some indications over the summer that we would get some more federal aid. You know, they were starting to debate between the administration and the Senate. And then, of course, what the House passed back in May, right? The U.S. House passed the second stimulus package back in May, and there's just been inaction on the Senate side and the administrative side. And so what do we think the likelihood of this will be? Well, every day it goes on without progress being made, the likelihood of this coming to fruition goes down. And so we've moved these federal assumptions out of this year and into the first quarter of next year, whether that happens in a lame duck session or after the inauguration of our new administration. You know, that is a little bit hard to tell. We might have to wait until late January under the Biden administration to see what will happen. Now, the direct effects of this, again, are support for small businesses, support for unemployed workers, and then maybe some grants for state and local governments. We shall see what the composition of the package would be. So in terms of the importance of this, why I say it's more of a medium, you know, importance assumption as opposed to a massive one like the vaccine, has to do with, you know, where we are is the state of the macro economy, right? Right now, all of the economic related indicators we have, all the economic related measures that we tend to look at in terms of jobs and income, housing, temp help workers and the like, all these things are growing and pointing towards ongoing growth. We're not in a recessionary environment anymore. We're still in a bad economy, but we're growing, we're digging our way out of it. And plus we've had a large increase in personal savings, a lot of increase in household savings so far this year. This chart on the left is US data. You know, how much do we have sitting in personal banking, you know, bank accounts around the country? It has increased tremendously. We're almost up to $1.5 trillion in increased saving this year because we have the income support from the federal government. And at the same time, we've reduced our spending. You know, we're not able to spend as much as we typically do because of the restrictions to help, you know, stave off the pandemic. And then as a result, we're also taking out fewer loans and incurring less debt. And so when you combine that, higher incomes, less spending, less debt, it means our savings have increased. And this isn't savings that we're putting into retirement accounts or the stock market or investments or this. This is literally just money sitting in our bank accounts, not really doing anything at the moment. And so, you know, this could be spent. This will be spent in the years ahead. This will be spent especially when it is safe to do so. And if a vaccine is really coming in the next 6-9 months for everyone, then this will add a tremendous boost to the overall economy. And so this is why economists say, you know, a second federal package isn't a necessity from a macroeconomic perspective. The economy can grind its way out from a deep hole. We've done it before. We did it last decade, right? We had no federal support last decade for the economy. Yes, we had the big stimulus package, the ARA, you know, to stop the Great Recession from turning into a full-on depression. But after that, right, after the big stimulus package in 2009, the federal government provided basically no support to the economy, and we had a slow, steady growth, grinding our way out for a decade. And so we can do that again. And so that's why economists are saying federal aid is not, you know, a key linchpin to the economy. That said, we know it'll help tremendously. There's large swaths of the economy, there's large swaths of our labor force that can't recover until the pandemic is over, and we need to do as much as we can to assist them so that they don't drown in debt, they don't close their doors permanently, and they don't drop out of the labor force entirely. This chart on the left looks at the kind of the amount of pain that's out there. This is comparing the number of officially unemployed Oregonians in red with all of the Oregonians that are receiving unemployment insurance benefits through the various programs. And you can see, right, we have about 250,000 Oregonians right now receiving some form of unemployment insurance benefits. So that they are either out of work entirely, or they've had their hours reduced, or they've had their, you know, consulting business income crater due to the pandemic. They're hurting, and so they're still receiving benefits. The key thing to point out here is not that we just lost the $600 a week in additional benefits over the summer back in July. That expired. The key here is not that we have all these additional benefits. These are just kind of regular payments, which replace 30 to 40% of your income. They don't replace 100% of your income. These regular payments kind of, 30 to 35, 40% is what the average recipient in Oregon tends to receive in terms of wage replacement. The key here is that these go away almost entirely, literally the day after Christmas. They end December 26th. And so that will be a big drag on these impacted workers and their households, and then of course the businesses that they came from that are facing restrictions and lower levels of sales in the months ahead. So there's a lot of pain out there. It's being masked at the top line because a lot of this pain is in these leisure and hospitality firms. A lot of these are, to be honest, right, they're lower paying jobs. And even if we have hundreds of thousands of people making low wages or out of work, it maybe doesn't move the needle at the aggregate level because all the people at the middle and top end of the income spectrum are doing relatively well, right? High wage jobs are only down a couple percentage points, plus asset markets, stock markets, home valuations, and the like are at historic highs. And so we know with income inequality, the people at the top account for an outsized share of income and spending. And so if the people at the top end of the spectrum are doing relatively well, then therefore our aggregate data in terms of overall income and spending are doing okay, even if we're seeing all of this pain among our lowest income neighbors, family, and friends. And so this would be where the federal aid package will be the most important, again, to help these businesses not shutter completely, to help these impacted workers who face dim job prospects until the end of the pandemic, right? You can't go back to your restaurant or your bar until the pandemic is over and the customers return in full force because they're fearful, right? Whether we have, official regulations or restrictions in place or not, people still won't go out to the same extent they did before out of fear of the virus. And so we can't recover fully until the pandemic is over. And so therefore we should, as a society, we should help these impacted families and friends associated with that. And so that is why, a federal package would be important, would be to help the people most impacted by the pandemic, even if it's maybe not as big of a deal from a macroeconomic perspective. So you put all this together and you can see this chart here. I know I showed this last time. This compares recessions in Oregon in recent decades. The way you read this, if you start in the upper left-hand corner, that's how many jobs you had at the start of the recession, how many jobs you had at the peak level of employment before you drop down and plunge into recession. As you fall down, that's the severity of the recession. What percentage of your jobs were lost? As you work your way back up to the right, that's the recovery phase. You're adding jobs, you're gaining ground, but you're still lower than you were prior to the recession. As you hit zero and go above it, you've fully regained all of your jobs and you're at an all-time high for employment, and you get back to a healthy economy eventually. And you can see the red lines where we are today. The solid red is through October. The dashed red is our forecast. You can see, of course, it looks unlike anything we've seen before. This what really looks more like a labor strike or a natural disaster, given it's related to a pandemic. Maybe the natural disaster is a more apt comparison than your sort of traditional recessionary environment. And you can see it, not only does the recession look different, our recovery path does too, right? We're thinking the recovery path will be a lot faster than the last couple of times we've been in a severe recession in Oregon. You go look at the 1980s, coming out of that, we had a massive timber industry restructuring. We had big challenges we had to overcome and reorient our economy to account for something, that was starting to decline for the first time. Coming out of the 2007, 2009 recession, the Great Recession, we had a massive housing bubble. And more importantly, we had a massive household debt overhang. Households were too indebted based on those inflated home prices. And they had to reorient their balance books, right? And to get their spending more in line with their income and not believing, well, I got this home equity I can tap and I can tap and I can tap and take on too much debt to buy cars or to remodel or to buy boats or whatever the case may be. And so we had to rebalance our economy, reorient our economy, and get rid of that household debt overhang, right? So those are major, major problems that we had to work through, and they resulted in that 7-year cycle, a 7-year recovery cycle. Today, we don't have any of those problems, right? Today, the economy was, as strong as it had ever been, basically, back in February, right? It was probably the second or the third strongest economy in Oregon's history, I would get, by my gauge, right? So we don't have massive problems we need to overcome other than the pandemic. So once we can get that vaccine, we can return to the office in greater numbers. We can reopen our schools. You'll see we got the little arrow there where we are assuming schools return to in-person learning next fall. This has two effects. Not only does it mean we'll hire back a bunch of teachers, including substitutes, right? Right now, we're using very few substitutes, and substitutes account for 10 to 15% of all teaching positions, right? And so if you're not using substitutes, that means the number of teachers that have a job declines by 10 to 15%, right? Which is a big number. And so they'll go back to work. And then, of course, we'll get a labor supply response as parents are able to go back to work as well. Right now, we have about 1 in 5 Oregonians meet the description that they have kids at home. They cannot work remotely. You know, they can't, their job, they have to go into the bar or the restaurant, or they have to go into the warehouse, or they have to drive the truck. They don't have a job that you can do with just a computer and an internet connection. And they don't have another non-working adult present in the household, right? And so they're in a bind. They either have to stay home to make sure their kids are logging into these live meetings and getting their homework done and uploading it in the thing, or they have to go to work and then they have to worry about their kids' education. And so once we're returned to in-person learning, all of these things, these secondary impacts associated with the pandemic, or I guess these are primary impacts associated with the pandemic on the economic front, will start to lessen and start to correct themselves, right? And so that will be a key linchpin into the economy, into the overall economic and revenue outlook. And of course, you see, we'll get back to full employment. We'll get back all of our jobs by mid-2023. We'll get to full employment again in 2024. The reason why those things are a little bit different is we've had ongoing population growth, right? And so just getting the same number of jobs again doesn't mean we'll get back to as strong of economy as we saw back in February, because we've had ongoing population growth and things like that. So we need to have even more job growth for the year after that before we get fully back to a healthy economy. But provided the pandemic, you know, the end of it is in sight, given the positive vaccine news. And by end in sight, I mean we're still 6 to 9 months away, probably at least, from all of us being able to be vaccinated, right? Yes, they might start distributing it next month to the frontline workers, and then we'll move on to the elderly population and the like, but it's going to take quite a long time for all of us to be able to get vaccinated, and that's leaving to the side all the anti-vaxxers who won't take it in either, which is a whole nother discussion. So you put all this together, right? Again, our forecast is relatively stable, relatively unchanged. Here's our revenue numbers. The way you read the table is this is the forecast we released yesterday, and this is just the straight dollar difference, the delta, the change between that and what we put out a few months ago. These are in millions of dollars, and so they're up about $150 million this biennium, next biennium, as they're beginning to build that budget. So relatively a little bit better news. Of course, to you and me, millions of dollars is an astronomical sum in the context of a $25 billion state budget. That's just on the general fund side of things. You know, it's relatively small. It's not a rounding error, but I think, you know, it's relatively small, but still good news. This upward revision is coming from two places. It's coming from corporate taxes, corporate excise taxes specifically. Corporate profits continue to do well. We had a brief blip earlier this year where corporate profits were down, but since then they've returned, right? Unlike past cycles where corporate profits have fallen by 50%, and then it's taken a year or two for them to rebound. So far this cycle, corporate profits haven't done that, at least in the, you know, the macroeconomic sense of it. And so we've been revising up our corporate outlook accordingly. And then we get a little bit of additional money from lottery. Lottery sales continue to be strong, but this does not bake in that two-week closure on the video lottery terminal. So that plus 17 there should probably be -9, -10 if that was in here. But overall, not a large change even for the lottery perspective. And then we continue to get a little bit of extra marijuana money. Now, in the big picture of the state budget, if we look at the chart on the right, you know, the positive news is that state revenues have not cratered. We talked about this last time for all the reasons the economy is doing better than expected in terms of the federal aid, the nature of the layoffs being disproportionately on the low income workers and the like. And so state revenues have not cratered, but we've entered into this kind of flat period. You can see basically for the 2017-19 biennium, the gray bar, the 2019-21 biennium, our current 2-year budget period that's over the summer, and then the next one, 21-23, which starts next summer, those are relatively the same amount of revenue for the state. So it's a flat budgetary environment for 6 years, where at the same time, population's growing up, inflation and costs are going up. And of course, in a recessionary environment, we have increases in needs-based programs for healthcare assistance and for food assistance and the like. And so when you have flat revenues, but increasing needs, both due to ongoing costs and the increase in need, it does create budget pressure. The difference here is we haven't seen the increase in need plus a cratering in the revenues. Here we have flat revenues, but the increase in the need. And so as our public officials begin to fully grapple with this environment, as the governor's putting out her budget in a couple of weeks and the legislature will start in a couple months in full force, they've already started some, but in full force, it's still a challenging budget environment. And so, I don't envy that position, but at least the economy hasn't cratered, the revenues haven't cratered like we first expected they would at the start of the pandemic. And so with that, that's everything I kind of had prepared this morning, the quick high-level summary of where we are. The outlook is relatively stable, it's relatively unchanged, it's up a little bit, but we're relying on those key assumptions of the vaccine timeline by late next summer. We are putting in a federal aid package, which will certainly help the most impacted businesses and workers, and we fingers crossed we get that, because those people need that. And then we're really looking to minimize the amount of permanent business closures and long-term unemployed Oregonians. Those would be the key linchpins. Only if we can get those things, then I think we'll be all right.
Thank you, Josh. Once again, lots to think about. We do have one question in the Q&A at this point. So it's from Brad Smith. Do the recovery numbers assume a change in income for commercial leases, meaning fundamental changes to business need for office space and retail space?
I think I don't remember if we talked about this explicitly last time. It comes up quite a bit, and I think commercial real estate more broadly is one of those key risks to the next handful of years for the reasons you're talking about. It's about the amount of foot traffic in our commercial districts, whether it's downtown or just in our more commercial districts spread throughout the state. That is dropping demand for a lot of our small storefronts, bars and restaurants and the like, plus the drop in tourism, especially the air travel related tourism, the long distance travel. That has reduced our demand in these commercial districts considerably, and we're going to see a lot of vacancies, I think. The question is, how quickly are they filled? Because you're talking about valuations, right? That if we have larger vacancies, those rents go down, those future property valuations go down. How does that have to get written on the balance sheet of the people the property owners? There's a lot of risk here. I think the good news to date, the silver lining of a sort, it's still bad. The relatively positive news is that the little bit of real-time business closure data we have doesn't look as bad as we had feared. Right now, 92% of bars and restaurants are renewing their liquor licenses the last 2 quarters. So in the second quarter and the third quarter, 92% of them that were coming due renewed their liquor licenses, whereas normally it's more like 97, 98%. So there's been a drop, but 5-6 percentage point drop is maybe not as much. I thought it would be larger than that. That still might come. That still might come as the pandemic drags on. And we expect it to worsen, but that's on the margin. That's better than we had thought. And so again, and that would spread throughout the commercial real estate. The office side of things, that one's a lot harder to gauge. People are talking a big game about the shift to working from home and the like. But workers are already being recalled to the office, right? About 20% of the people that were working from home at the start of the pandemic have already been recalled to the office. And so where that shifts ultimately is a hard thing to know. I think there will be some increase, which means we will have a reduction in traditional office space demand. So whether we have to repurpose that for residential housing in downtowns and commercial districts or not, hard to know, but I think that we'll certainly face some of those challenges.
There's also two questions in the chat. One is from Mayor Truax about the federal aid policies and how do we deal with the difficult Senate leadership in regard to another iteration of the CARES package. And then the second question along those lines is from Frank Angelo, and that is, how large does the federal package need to be to have a positive impact?
That's a tough one, right? Yeah, to be honest, in terms of the top line economic and revenue forecast for the state, or for the US, for the state, I personally do not believe a federal package is that key linchpin, right? For all those reasons I was talking about, I do think we can grind our way out of this. I do not think if we get no further federal aid, if we have gridlock in Washington, D.C. and continued inaction, as long as we get that vaccine, we will be not okay, but we will get out of this, right? It's for those distributional concerns. One of the problems with not receiving aid last cycle is we had this massive record high increase in long-term unemployment. And we'd see a massive decline in labor force participation. And it took a decade for all of those people to come back, right? It took a long time. Once you drop out of the labor force, you get used to, however you are managing your life, whether you're taking care of the kids or taking care of a parent or whatever it is, you do things. Like you're not like you're just sitting around playing video games, right? We know that. And so it took maybe not the full decade, but it took at least 7 years before some of those people who dropped out of the labor market in 2010, it took them until 2017, 2018 before they came back and started finding jobs, right? And so that creates has long-term societal, human, and economic cost. And so to the extent that we get federal aid, it needs to be targeted to those people so that we don't have to go through that again, right? Because that was such a traumatic experience. There's been a lot of permanent damage associated with the weak recovery that we had last cycle that took so long. And so that, I think, is absolutely critical that we don't see that happen again. But if we did, does that mean the economy is going to crater and be in this permanent bad state forever? I think, the answer is unlikely that it will not.
Thank you. Jim McCrate has a question in the Q&A. Would a reduction in corporate and personal income taxes stimulate growth?
I think a lot of our traditional models would say yes, right? If you lower tax rates, you do get better growth. But there's also if you were to how do I want to say this, right? If you were to reduce tax rates, the models would certainly say that you would get faster growth. That faster growth is never strong enough to make up for the reduction in the taxes in terms of public sector revenues, right? Never do you reduce taxes and then the stronger economic growth, should it come, result in a strong enough economy to make up for the lost revenues, right? You get some of them back, but not 100% of them back. And so that would be one thing to consider. The other thing to consider, of course, the devil's always in the details. What would the restructuring look like? As a rough example, not the CARES Act, the TCJA, or the Tax Cut and Jobs Act from 2017 at the federal level, right? We had a big reduction in corporate taxes, and then we saw no real boon in business investment, right? Immediately. Now, this be a long-term play, reduction in corporate revenues or corporate taxes. If that results in stronger investment over the decade, then you can say maybe, we saw a better outcome associated with changing the tax code on corporations. But at least between that 2 years between the passage of the law and the start of the pandemic, we didn't see an immediate boost to business investment even after a big reduction. So these things come with lags, and there's long-term considerations, and it's about the detail. Make sure that if you're going to do that, you structure it such that it would generate the strongest growth. Which I think is fair to say the composition of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was such that it was not designed to stimulate the most growth. I think, that's a fair characterization of it.
Thank you. Gwen Baldwin asked, how are the gas tax revenues doing?
So the last I saw, we're somewhere in the neighborhood of driving in the state is down 6 or 7% over a year ago. Um, in my little anecdotal world, I can't tell that traffic is down, right? It seems like it's all the way back, but so 5-6%, 5-10%. And so therefore, if driving's back and gasoline consumption is back, then the taxes are somewhere in that same range. I think nationally, or maybe more like, I think I saw 8, 9, 10% down. Federal gas taxes are that, but I think our Oregon data is more like, you know, in that 6-7% range. Last time I talked to ODOT.
Thank you. Stephen Smelly asks, what are the estimated impacts to the retail sector given the timing of the statewide freeze? I think timing is the key question there.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the retail side, you know, I am not a business owner. I'm not a small retailer, you know, trying to get people to come into my store and buy stuff. So I don't know what the day-to-day experience of that will be like. I think more broadly, but in the broader sense, 75% capacity in your store is relatively, you know, is not going to be as huge of an impact, certainly, than what Washington's doing with the 25% capacity, right? That is going to be a massive restriction. Now, if you're trying to go to Costco on a Saturday afternoon, it's always, you know, that 75% capacity is going to be a binding constraint. If you're trying to go to a commercial district and window shop and the things like that, I'm not sure how much of a constraint 75% will be. Fingers crossed, it won't be that much. If you do some rough modeling, so again, we've only had a few days to think about this. If we look at consumer spending across everything, housing, gasoline, going out to eat, everything, and we say, and we shock some of these things. We shock retail by 50%. We shock bars and restaurants by 80%. They see a reduction for 2 weeks at this time of year. You know, it comes up to about 9% of monthly sales, aggregate, right? That across the entire economy. But of course, that's an 80% reduction for bars and restaurants, but it's 9% for the month for the overall consumer spending. That's 3% for the quarter. To the extent that retail rise heavily on the holiday season, 3% during your bump, you know, your biggest season, that's going to be noticeable. And of course, if again, that's economy-wide and not firm-specific and sector-specific. It's going to be larger than that.
Thank you. Anthony Martin asks, is there a correlation between the size of a business and effect of the pandemic? Are smaller businesses always hurting more, or does it depend on the sector? Interesting question.
Yes, there's a lot going on in there, and I think the answer is yes. If we look at the data, right? If we look at the last 40 years that we have good data, big businesses have continued to win out, right? Big businesses have only gotten bigger. Entrepreneurship, the share of the economy from smaller firms continues to shrink. Big businesses are getting larger. So for a variety of reasons, we're not going to go into those today, but so to that extent, yes, it's always been a struggle. I think the concern here with the pandemic is that small businesses so we did a bunch of this, you know, 6 months ago. So small businesses, the median small business had 1 to 2 months of liquid reserves. So they had enough savings or whatnot to cover 1 to 2 months of sales. And you know, 40% couldn't even cover a month, right? This was the median, the 50 percentile. And so now that we're in our 9-month of pandemic, you know, those reserves are gone. Even with the PPP is not ineffective, as in, you know, it wasn't properly sized, it wasn't continued, it wasn't big enough, it didn't last long enough. It still helped, but still, even with that, we know 1 month of reserves plus 2 months of PPP. I can do the math, that's 3, and we're now in month 9. And so there's always going to be struggles. Small businesses, they rely on the cash reserves of the owner. They rely on home equity of the owner, which you can tap. Right now is a great time. Well, you don't want to tap your home equity, but now would be a time where we have a lot of home equity that you could use to try and keep things afloat. But the issue here is that large businesses have access to capital markets. They can go out, issue stocks and things like that. They can stop paying a dividend to retain some extra earnings. Whatever the case could be, they have a lot more access. And so a time like this does exacerbate that big versus small dynamic. because you need deep pockets and you have to hire additional people to check the temperatures at the front door or to count people as they're coming in or whatever the case may be. And so I do think this is particularly hard on small businesses as large for all those things we discussed, and it's wider than normal.
How much effect do you think the $55 million package that the governor is putting into businesses statewide is going to have? And this should add on to that question.
Everything helps, right? And I don't know the details of the program that she just announced. And I know the speaker yesterday proposed another 100 million that she said we should have another special session and top that up by another 100 or so. And certainly that's all needed. And it's going to be helpful. Again, with fingers crossed, the end of the pandemic in sight, then, we really need to do everything we can to minimize the number of businesses that close and the long-term unemployment associated with that, to make sure that recovery really does happen by 2023. If we see more closures and a lot of these issues, or we don't get the vaccine, ultimately it fails, then we're on that 7-year trajectory instead of the 3-year trajectory.
Keith Peel asked, the recent report from OBI suggests that business tax burden has increased by 41% since 2019. Has all this additional revenue been included in your projections?
Yes, the corporate activity tax specifically is. Right now, we've had 3 estimated payments. Unfortunately, we got a brand new tax that we've never seen before in Oregon, and that kind of only exists kind of similarly in about 3 other states. And so, our counterparts in the legislature had to make estimates of what this would look like. And then we had a pandemic and a recession on top of it. And so it looks like it's coming in smaller than initial estimates indicated. But how much of that is due to the structure of the tax being something we didn't understand completely from a data perspective versus the recession and the pandemic itself? We'll see. It's still real new. We've had 3 quarterly estimated payments. We'll get the annual tax returns in April. They'll be processed in May, and then we'll start to have a better understanding of that tax burden by sector and things like that. And we'll know a lot more. But right now, we're just taking in estimated payments, and we can't really learn anything from them in the first year. So we're still flying blind.
Thank you. Kemp Shuey from Community Action asked that the CARES Act funding ends at the end of this year, as does the state's eviction moratorium. Since federal aid is not expected until the first quarter of 2021, we face a strong likelihood of mass evictions to start up the year. How does an event like this impact the state's economic projections?
So this is one we really struggle with, right? Because we didn't have access to data before this year in a timely manner about how many people were behind on rent and things like that, right? And so now we have data. We have some data coming from the Census Bureau and the like, and it doesn't show. So we've had data basically since May through today. And it doesn't show an increase in people behind on rent or people struggling, right? It's been relatively steady, but that doesn't mean it's not worse than it was last year, right? I think the hard thing to interpret is even in the strongest economies we've had in our lifetimes, we still have 10% of our friends and neighbors are in poverty, right? And it seems like based on national data, there's always 20% of people behind on rent, right? We always have at least 10% in poverty and 20% of people behind on rent. That's even in the best economies we've seen. And so we've always had this need. We've always had struggling people that need assistance to the best of our ability. And so how much has that increased this year? It's a little hard to know based on the limited information we have. And so yes, there's tens of thousands of Oregonians that are behind on rent and are expected to be, they're even saying in these surveys, they're expected to be evicted in the months ahead. And if you do some rough math on the little bit of characteristics we can get by number of household, we can get by their household income levels, and then we can kind of impute, we can kind of guess what their rent payment is. Well, every month that these people that are answering these surveys that say they're behind, that's about $70 million, right, in total rent. So whether they're making partial payments or not, that's only the landlords know that. But for every month, and we're now 9 months, we're in the month 9, and if you say, some of the national data showed that by August or September, some of the lower income households' savings in their bank accounts, they got the $1,200 that boosted up their savings, and they kind of spent it down by August, September. And so October, November, December, right? That's at least 3 months. You're probably looking at least a couple $100 million statewide behind on rent. And so it's a big challenge. The hard thing to know is whether this is larger than normal, because this has always been the case. We just haven't focused on it as much.
So Allison Hart asks, have business starts been factored into this data? Typically in this type of economy, business starts increase. Can you please comment on this?
That's one of the best data points we have, and most encouraging data points. So yes. So business applications for new businesses haven't declined. They're the same as they were last year, both if we look at Census Bureau data and if we look at the actual filings at the Secretary of State here in Oregon. The Secretary of State ones are actually up. The Census Bureau ones are flat, which is still really, really good news, because in the past two severe recessions, the 80s and the Great Recession, we had the increase in closures and a drop in new businesses, right? We had that exacerbated this problem. Whereas in 1990 and the 2001 recessions, as you're saying, startups held steady while we had a little bit more closures. And so we're more in that dynamic where we have an increase in closures, but steady new startup activity. That should help us in the recovery phase, where that's one of the most encouraging things we've seen, that we haven't seen that drop off in startups. And so fingers crossed that bodes well for future growth. It should.
Thank you. I'm going to jump to a question from Don Drake. At what point does the state run out of the ability to fund unemployment if current situation regarding shutdown goes in one or two quarter into the first or second quarter of next year?
I believe, I haven't seen the detailed modeling on that in a couple of months, but years. We have, at the start of the pandemic, the start of the recession, we had $5.1 billion in our unemployment insurance trust fund. We were the number one or number two most funded state in the entire country. We went in after the 2001-2003 cycle. State of Oregon went in and fixed the unemployment insurance trust fund. Of course, we didn't fix our technology, but we fixed the money associated with that. And so we're very well funded. We can withstand an ongoing onslaught of payments outdoor for years at this point. And so it's done really, really well from a money perspective. We struggled with the technology and the processing the claims, of course, as everyone knows. And so it's not a matter of money. And if you do run out of money, like every other state is, you just borrow from the feds and you have to pay it back at some point. But we don't even have to borrow from the feds. We didn't borrow during the Great Recession. We won't borrow this cycle. Fingers crossed.
Thank you. Another question from Kimberly Culbertson. What do you project the long-term effects of work from home will have on cities and other public entities, I'd add, that have not invested in culture, community identity, and quality of life?
The first part's a little easier to answer than the second. I think working from home was always expected to continue to increase in the years ahead. The question is just how much more will it? Because people were forced to, right? They were forced to at the start of this thing, and some of us are still forced to. And maybe you get used to it and you say, hey, it's not so bad. Maybe we can do this on a more regular basis. I think what's going to matter for the economy, what's going to matter for individual cities, what's going to matter for housing markets, what's going to matter for that traditional office space demand, as was asked earlier, is to what degree do we do this? If it's a permanent 100% working from home, then workers are untethered. They're free to live anywhere they want, right? And so then, and traditionally, what does that mean? Traditionally, that means they're going to go live in Astoria, Hood River, or Bend, right? They're going to live in these really nice places scenically, but you still can get near an airport, or you can still be within a couple hours of the major cities, or whatever the case may be. There's hope. There's hope that maybe they'll choose to live in Prineville and Boardman and John Day, or other places that are still scenic and pretty, but a little more further flung, and help with economic diversification there. That's in the 100% remote world. But we're probably not going to that for most people. I think what we'll probably see is telecommuting as an employee perk or an employee benefit, where you can do it 1 or 2 or 3, maybe even 4 days a week. You can work from home, but you still need to be in the office every week, or you need to be in the office every 2 weeks, or whatever the case may be. Something more like that is probably where we're going to end up. I know a lot of businesses, maybe they're just louder than the other ones, but there's a lot of businesses that are complaining about it. And they're saying we need to get back to the office. Our productivity is down, especially with our junior employees. You know, they're doing TikTok videos all day instead of doing the work all day, sort of thing, right? And so that seems to be a concern. And so we'll go back to the office at least some of the time. And if that's the case, which I'm more in that camp, my belief, that could increase demand for the suburbs relative to the city center. You don't need to live in Ladd's Addition if you don't have to go across the bridge into downtown every day in Portland, right? Maybe you could live, you know, in beautiful places like, I don't know, Forest Grove, Banks, or whatever the case may be. Like, you can live there, and if you only have to go into the office once a week, you'll deal with that commute going in on the highway, right? If it's only once a week, you can put up with it easier. And so that, I think, is maybe where we'll end up, but we'll see.
So I'm sorry that we're going to have to close. We have a couple more questions that are in the Q&A. One about federal assistance in the distribution, another about the increase or acceleration in automation, and the last more of a comment about the state just raised all of the UI rates for 2021. We're like 1 minute away from close. I want to say thank you, Josh. If you could take a moment and communicate with us your thoughts on those 3 questions so that we can post them, that'd be great. So I want to thank you once again for being with us. We look forward to seeing you again soon. When's your next when is your next forecast?
It's going to be sometime in February. It hasn't been set yet.
Okay. Well, we'll look forward to a forum with you again, I hope. So thank you. And I'd also like to thank our sponsor for today, Kaiser Permanente, and our Forum Series sponsor, Legacy Health. We do have some upcoming events. Teresa, if you could put those up. We have our joint committee meeting on November 23rd. It's been sent to all the committee members. This is a time for Jeff Newgard to talk with us about tax implications of some of the measures that have come forward. We have our transportation committee meeting on December 9th. We have our last board of directors meeting on December 16th. And we also have our land use and housing committee meeting on December 16th. So in closing, what I'd like to remind all of you that we do send out a survey. It's very helpful when you fill those out. I appreciate looking at all of the comments, and it gives us clues and tips on how to improve these presentations for you into the future. I also want to again wish you all a happy Thanksgiving, a small Thanksgiving, a meaningful Thanksgiving. And I want to express our gratitude at Westside Economic Alliance for your membership, your interest, and again, our gratitude for our presenters. So thank you, Josh. With that, is there any closing remarks from you, Josh?
No, I think I said enough for a day, but yeah, no, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and a lot of good questions today, so I appreciate that.
We have a great membership with great questions. So you answered over 10 of them. So I appreciate that. And thank you to everybody who is in attendance today. Take care. Have a great day.
Thank you.